that. So I just want to say thank you for everyone for joining with us this afternoon. This event is being hosted by the Digital Inclusion Working Group. So we are delighted to have this event this afternoon, which is taking place as part of the Limerick Lifelong Learning Festival. It's now in its 10th year, and this year's theme is about celebrating and building learning communities. The event has been organised by the Digital Inclusion Working Group, and we thought it would be a great opportunity for us to share our learning so far about our digital inclusion research project. So before I start, I am just going to give a quick outline of the event, of our outline for the day. 1 second. So we will start, I'll just give a brief overview of who we are, what the research is about, and then I'll hand it over to Rachel Hastings-Kaplan, who's one of the researchers from the Tavistock Institute, who will give a presentation on our emerging findings from our research project. We will then hand over to Dr. Elena Hamburg, who's head of the Lifelong Learning Studies Group in the Institute for Work and Technology in Gelsenkirchen in Germany, who will talk a little bit about digital inclusion and COVID-19 from their perspective. And then we'll have a panel discussion and where we have a number of speakers who will introduce later on in the session. And then at the end, we'll have an opportunity for some questions and answers for people if they would like to contribute to the discussion. We'd encourage people to, while we're having the presentations and the panel discussion, to keep their microphones on mute, but to use the chat facility. My colleague, Rosie Perez-Goodbody, is on hand. She's going to be keeping an eye on the chat messaging system throughout the session, and we have some time at the end. We're going to share some of that. So I hope people will find it interesting, and hopefully, as I said, it's part of Lifelong Learning Week, and that people might find something that's new, and they might learn something new about what we're finding out around digital exclusion and inclusion during this era. So a little bit about who we are. We are the Digital Inclusion Working Group. We were set up now. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. So we're a working group that came together a couple of years back following the launch of the Smart Limerick strategy, which is Limerick's strategy to developed by Limerick City and County Council to develop Limerick as a smart city where we can use technology and digital developments to enhance how we live our lives and how we engage with services. So as part of that, a number of agencies came together because we want to ensure as we develop our city in this way that we leave no person behind. And so we want to have a look at the whole area of digital exclusion and digital inclusion. So as you can see from the slide there, it's made up of a number of agencies at the moment: Limerick City and County Council, the Education and Training Board, Paul Partnership, West Limerick Resources, Ballyhara Development, and Mary Immaculate College. But it is open still to other members from other organisations who feel that they have, I suppose, an interest in looking at the whole area of digital exclusion, and in particular promoting strategies to promote digital inclusion. So that's who we are. And so again, just 1 second, when we started to come together and look at this whole area, I suppose the big question we had is, what do we mean today about what it means to be digitally included or digitally excluded in today's society? A couple of years back, a number of us in the group were involved in another piece of research which looked at this whole area, but it looked at it in terms, primarily it looked at it in terms of, do people have access to the internet or broadband or to a computer or to a device? And that still is very much relevant today, but we also felt there are probably broader factors in today's society which impacts on whether people can be digitally included or excluded. So we felt we needed to learn ourselves more about this area before we could, I suppose, advise on how we move forward in terms of developing supports and initiatives to promote digital inclusion and social inclusion. So I suppose to enhance our knowledge and learning, we started this research project, and we, following a public procurement process and tendering process, the Tavistock Institute in London was awarded the contract to look at this whole area about what do we mean today about digital inclusion, what does it look like, or digital exclusion, what does it look like, what does it mean for different people, and how do we address it. So that's where we are, and we started this research last year, and we did the primary research in February with a series of telephone interviews and focus groups with members of different communities in Limerick City and County in February, just before COVID hit. So we had quite a good bit of research done, and then things shut down as it happened with the lockdown. And I suppose the timing of it was quite, quite significant in that in the months since, I think people's awareness of digital inclusion and digital exclusion has become quite, it's come to the fore. And so we thought, even though we're not finished the project, we'd pause. It was a good time, I suppose, to present back some of the learnings we've had so far. And as we go forward the next few months, we believe there's a second stage of primary research that will be done to try and capture more of the learning of what life is like in terms of people and I suppose the experience of digital exclusion and inclusion in the last couple of months. So we'll talk more about that towards the end of the session. So at this stage now, I'm going to hand over to one of our researchers. So Rachel Hastings-Kaplan is a researcher with the Tavistock Institute and has worked there since 2019. As well as working on this research project for us, she has been involved in the Medici project, which is an EU project looking at mapping digital inclusion projects across the EU. And she also works in a number of projects that work with vulnerable people and looking at services and how they can be designed to best meet their needs. So with that, I will hand over the screen to Rachel, who will take us through the findings so far from our research. So Rachel, you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, Helen. So hi there, everyone. My name's Rachel Hastings-Kaplan. As Helen said, I'm a researcher at the Tavistock Institute of Human Relations. So we're a social science organisation based in London. So myself and my colleague David Drabble, who'll be speaking on the panel later.
Rich, can I interrupt you there for a second? Your sound is quite low. I don't know if it's on my side.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's strange.
Yeah, if you could.
I've moved the screen a bit closer. Has that made any difference?
I think it's a little bit better, yes.
A little bit.
Yeah.
Do you think it's okay to continue?
We'll try. If people find it difficult, you might just use the messaging system to let us know. And maybe Rosa, you might interrupt and say, do we need to look at the sound?
Yeah. Okay, great. I'll carry on then. So my colleague and myself were commissioned to do this research project on exploring what digital exclusion looks like in Limerick for the Digital Inclusion Working Group. So as Helen already mentioned, there are a couple of things to say about the research, first of all. So what I'm presenting is the emerging findings about the first phase of the research. There is further work to do, which I'll explain a little bit more about at the end. And also, so the research was commissioned and the fieldwork was completed before COVID, so a lot has changed since then. But I think the message around the importance of digital inclusion is stronger than ever. I'm seeing in the comments that the sound is still a bit low. I'm not sure. Does anyone have any ideas about what to do about that?
Yeah, we still have one comment that your sound is quite low.
Yeah, I saw that. Do I need to change my settings in Zoom? Potentially, or?
I'm not sure.
It may be a case of speaking louder than normal, close to the camera. This is probably a good example of our reliance on technology. Doesn't always go to plan.
I'm just going to unmute myself for a second. I think it sounds to me, this is Bridget Dillon here in the LES, it sounds to me like you're just too far away from the microphone on your device. That's what it sounds like from where I'm sitting. I have that problem too sometimes. So really? I don't know if that helps.
I'm quite close to it. You're all going to get a very in-depth picture of my face if I move it any closer. So might have to trade off that against being able to hear me. Is that any better for anyone?
I think we'll just have to, we'll go with this.
I'm hearing loud and clear. That's brilliant news. Okay. Lovely. If we could go on to the next slide, please, Helen. So there were a number of objectives that we wanted to address through our research, and I'll take you through those briefly now. So through our research for the Digital Inclusion Working Group, we wanted to define digital inclusion and exclusion and understand what factors surround them. We wanted to understand what digital inclusion services are available in Limerick and who they serve, to identify who's at risk of digital exclusion, in what way they're excluded, and how this impacts their lives, to inform responses to digital exclusion in terms of solutions at the community and policy level, and then finally to provide evidence to support any future funding applications around digital inclusion. Next slide, please. So to answer these questions, we conducted our research in three main strands. So firstly, we did a review of the existing evidence around digital inclusion and exclusion on both a local and global scale, so we could really understand the specific context in Limerick, but also look more widely at what's going on in Ireland, in the EU and globally. So this involved looking at policy documents, various pieces of research and good practices in the field. We then conducted 10 telephone interviews with stakeholders working in organisations that offer key services to Limerick, including members of the working group. So the aim of this phase was to get a general picture of digital inclusion, what this looks like in Limerick, what services are available, and how different organisations are approaching digitalisation. We then finished this with 8 focus groups in Limerick. So these were face-to-face ones. We were very fortunate to get those in before lockdown was put in place. And these were done with some representatives of community organisations, but most of them were done with Limerick citizens. So these groups took place in Limerick City and in various areas around East and West Limerick. And the purpose of these groups was to look deeper into the specific experiences of citizens in Limerick, what barriers prevent people from getting online, and what support would help citizens access services online. So before we get any further, it would probably be useful to define what it is we mean when we talk about digital inclusion. So digital inclusion, as you would expect, is a relatively new field and one that doesn't have a single accepted definition. So from reviewing various research, we came up with this one. So digital inclusion is about supporting online connectivity, positive attitudes about and motivation to use digital tools, the acquisition of digital competences and the design of services so that they meet all user needs so as to make sure that everyone can contribute to and benefit from the digital economy in society and ensure that people have online capability to do the things that benefit them in their everyday life. It's a little bit of a mouthful. So we came up with this from having read all of the available evidence, and I'll take you through a little bit about what this evidence told us now. So across the literature that we reviewed, we saw that there were 3 key factors that really seemed to influence whether you were digitally excluded or included. So the first of these was connectivity. So this is whether you can practically access the internet through broadband, Wi-Fi, or a device. So barriers to connectivity can be the high cost of all of these, as well as the quality of your internet connection. So in 2018, the Central Statistics Office found that the top 3 reasons that households in Ireland do not have internet access are lack of availability of broadband, the high cost of equipment, and the high cost of access. So you can see how big of an issue this is. The second is usage capability. So this is whether people have the right skills to be able to use digital devices and services efficiently and effectively. So the term skills actually covers a really broad church. So it can refer not just to digital skills, but also to softer skills such as creative skills, literacy, and the knowledge to be able to use your digital skills to be able to help you in your everyday life. For example, being able to design a website to help you to promote your business. The same Central Statistics Office study found that 30% of Irish internet non-users felt that they lacked the right skills to be able to use the internet. And then lastly, we have quality of use. So this is whether online services are set up in a way that's easy to use for all user types. So this can include whether services are easy to use for people with different abilities or different levels of confidence. So for example, when you're registering for training to help you to gain digital skills, are you required to register online first? Or do you have to fill out lengthy paperwork, which can be really difficult for people with low levels of literacy? And so that brings us on to the 4th factor. So these first 3 factors that we've talked about are all quite practical ones, We felt that what was missing was people's attitudes towards and motivations to use digital tools. So these factors relate to perceptions, impressions, and feelings about the digital world. So these internal factors, which are called intersubjectivity, are needed to be included when talking about digital inclusion and exclusion. So a recent study by the Good Things Foundation categorised the different ways in which people's inner feelings about the internet can influence how likely they are to go online. So we've got these 4 different categories. So people may think it's not for me. People might not be able to see what benefit using the internet, getting online might bring to their everyday life. They may feel that it's too complex. This can often be felt by people who don't think they have the right skills and can perceive getting online to be overly complicated. It's too expensive. So again, relating to what we've spoken about in terms of the cost of devices and connectivity. Or I don't have the right support. So people may feel that even if they were to try and get online, the support might not be there in place to help them to get the most out of it. So this brings us to looking at who is particularly digitally excluded in Limerick. So from looking at the literature review and from our primary research, we were able to get a picture of what this looks like. So for the most part, this picture reflected the evidence that we saw around who's excluded in Europe overall. So affecting unemployed people, people on lower income, older people, people with disabilities, and people who have migrated from another country. However, there were some additional groups that emerged through our primary research being particularly excluded in Limerick. So these were people in rural areas who may lack broadband access or be able to attend training opportunities. So people with lower levels of literacy who may struggle to use the internet effectively and can find it hard to sign up for training opportunities. And we have travellers who again may be isolated and unable to access broadband, or the broadband in their area might be quite variable. And it's worth noting that people can fit into a number of these different categories at once, which can make addressing their exclusion really challenging, as you're having to work through several layers of disadvantage. In our primary research, we spoke to citizens who represented a range of these different digitally excluded groups, but we weren't able to speak to all of the groups, and I'll say a little bit more about this later. So next, we wanted to look at how citizens were using the internet. And from gathering the evidence around this, we could categorize these uses into internal and external use. So for internal, we would refer to things like using social media or watching videos on YouTube, things where it's generally quite an insular experience. You don't have to deal with another service in order to do so. However, for external use, this would refer to interactions with different service agencies. So for example, this might be applying for jobs or signing up for online banking. Often these were things where you had to fill out various forms and applications. So both of these internal and external uses depend on you having really good connectivity to the internet. You need to have the right skills to be able to access them. You also have to have confidence to be able to use them well. However, for external use, there are a couple of other factors that can influence how easy it is to use these services. For example, whether the service is set up in an intuitive way or whether there's adequate customer support. From speaking to citizens, we heard that people felt that a lot of areas of their lives were becoming more and more digitalized. While this can have benefits, it can be really difficult when the services that you need go online and you don't have the skills to access them. For example, if your local bank closes down and you have to use online banking, or if you're not able to go to the shops anymore and you have to use internet shopping. So the importance of ensuring that non-digital alternatives to customer support for those external services was really clear. So from speaking to service providers and citizens in Limerick, we heard that the reasons for digital exclusion are really complex and exist on a number of levels. And I'll run through all of these levels now. And go to the next slide. Lovely. So first of all, we have structural factors. So this refers to the way that services are set up in Limerick. So this can refer to the quality and availability of broadband, particularly in rural areas where there may not be a wide choice of providers and the coverage might be poor. For example, we can see in this quote, in our area there's only one broadband provider and the price is really high just for broadband. And there were also transport issues that people encountered. So this was particularly true in rural areas, where there may not be a lot of public transport. It may come at particular times, which might make it difficult to attend training opportunities. So this can prevent people both from accessing training opportunities, but also accessing the internet through public access points such as libraries. And next we have affordability. So again, the cost of using broadband in some rural areas can be really high, and we heard up to €60 a month in some areas. And in addition, the cost of mobile data can make non-broadband users of the internet have to ration their use of the internet if they're just accessing it on their phone. And devices can be really expensive as well. And for this reason, the majority of people we spoke to were using their mobiles rather than PCs or laptops, which were just seen as too expensive. And you can see from the quote that we have here that sometimes people were wary of spending money on something that they weren't sure if they needed. They weren't sure if they were going to be able to use it once they had it. Next, we have socioeconomic and sociocultural factors. So we saw in the research that there was often a close relationship between whether you experience disadvantage, such as low education and literacy, unemployment, low income, and whether you're digitally excluded. So in this quote from the service provider that we have here, they noted that they often had to book things in for their service users as they just didn't have the literacy skills. And as with social inclusion, digital inclusion factors can combine to create really complex needs, which are not always met by mainstream services that are offered to them. The evidence also suggested that digital exclusion can then amplify social exclusion, as basic services are increasingly moving online. For example, if you can't get online, you might not be able to apply for a job, which may then mean that you don't move out of unemployment, or you're not able to move into a higher income job. Next, we have knowledge and skills factors. So we found for particular groups like older people, people with lower levels of education, people with lower levels of literacy, and travellers often lacked basic digital competencies. And as well as these skills, people often lack the confidence in their digital and media competencies. And while there are available training courses to address these skills gaps, citizens could sometimes experience barriers to attending these for various reasons, including transport issues, as we've spoken about, which can make it difficult to attend courses, childcare issues, which can make it difficult to practically just leave the house, and also the perception that the things that you learn on courses aren't always applicable to your daily life. For example, if you want to learn how to use the internet so you know how to apply for a job, you might not find it so helpful to apply to a training course that teaches you Excel skills. Personal factors. So we saw that people who had little experience of using digital tools and services were more likely to view them negatively, and therefore were less likely to be motivated to increase their digital skills and apply these skills in everyday life. So often people with low levels of digital skills experience a lot of fear and anxiety. For example, fear of breaking their computer, of accidentally entering in their bank details and having them stolen. I think there are a lot of stories of people who knew about this happening or had heard about it, or maybe it happened to them. And there was a lot of fear around their experience of using the internet. And there was also a lot of shame about what they perceived others might think about them for not having had these skills. As you can see from this quote, that their granddaughter put all my phone numbers in my new phone, and I was actually ashamed. And there was also a group of people who actually felt resentment about the fact that they should have to go online at all, and said that they felt forced into doing so, which then made them less likely to feel like the internet that was something for them and something that they would get something out of. And then finally, we have organizational and operational factors. So this refers to the way that organizations set up their processes and how this can affect the customer experience. So for a lot of people, support services are becoming more and more mechanized, more automated, and it can be really difficult to get to speak to a real person on either face-to-face or on the end of the phone. And this can be a barrier for trying to use digital services if you don't think that the support you need is there if something goes wrong. And as we can see in the quote, Taking the first step can be daunting, especially if you're having to fill in a long form. As we saw earlier, some registration processes can be overly long and complicated and can prevent some people from signing up to digital services and support. And then another quote, MyGov and the National Childcare Schemes are particularly difficult. You need to have a MyGov ID, then log on. So we saw that some services were requiring users to have already signed up to another service before they could then sign up to another one. So for example, to access childcare funding, you have to already have a MyGov ID, as referenced in this quote. So taking all of these barriers into consideration, how can support be designed to help citizens to become digitally included? So we heard suggestions from various stakeholders and citizens that we spoke to, and they break down into these 4 key areas that I'll go through now. So there's a general approach that needs to be taken to any services or support or policy that's put in offer. So support should always be tailored to learners' needs. So, for example, training should take into account the fact that learners come in with different levels of experience and different levels of confidence. And they may also want to learn different things to help them in their everyday lives. So the example we gave earlier of someone who may want to learn how to apply for a job, but someone else may just want to learn how to use social media to keep in touch with their loved ones. And without structuring support around these specific uses, it's less likely that learners will then use these skills in their everyday lives and feel that they've got something out of it. And also time must be taken to develop trust and respect. So to combat some of the fear and shame that some people feel about learning how to use digital devices, support services should be really patient and respectful towards learners and giving them the space to learn at their own pace. We heard from some people that this approach is particularly beneficial for some groups who may be quite difficult to reach as well. For example, people who have migrated or in the traveller community, that taking the time to develop links and networks to be able to reach these people can really be valuable. And then we heard some suggestions for some specific support that could be offered. So we found there were some specific areas that needed to be addressed, such as a lack of confidence in engaging online and ensuring that literacy skills were in place. We heard that classes put on specifically to address these issues would be welcomed by some, and that these classes would need to be small and tailored to learners' needs, as we mentioned earlier. And affordable devices was something that was mentioned. So as we've said, while most citizens we spoke to own smartphones, these can be really difficult to use for some functions. For example, for filling in forms or for making applications, due to the small screen size, this can make it really challenging, especially if you're not totally confident in your digital skills. So we did hear that some citizens we spoke to weren't aware of tablets, which are more affordable than PCs or laptops and often easier to use due to their larger screen size. And lastly, in terms of training, we heard that a blended approach to learning was something that was suggested by citizens and stakeholders. So this is an approach that blends face-to-face mentoring with self-directed practical learning. So citizens can learn to use digital tools at their own pace. And then service design was another area. So this is looking at how existing services can be redesigned or rethought in order to serve Limerick citizens. So we heard that to combat the view that registration processes can be overly long and complex, these should be revisited to be as straightforward and jargon-free as possible to prevent people from falling at the first hurdle when they go to seek support. We also heard that as transport issues could be a real barrier for accessing services and support, this might be an area that could be looked at, for example, by subsidising public transport to help individuals to be able to attend training opportunities or other support. And then finally, we heard some feedback around what the long-term goals should be around any support that's offered. So we'd heard that a number of interventions had been used for citizens in Limerick, including the Digital Skills for Citizen course in East Limerick. And also we'd heard of a scheme whereby older people had been provided with tablets. So we felt that these practices should be evaluated in order to understand what works when helping citizens to become more digitally included and how they can be scaled up and out to the wider community. So in terms of next steps, as Helen has already said, we will be doing a next phase of research, not entirely sure when, it's sort of COVID pending. And the reasons for this is, firstly, as we've already said, in order to focus on COVID and its impact, since our research was written up, a lot has changed. And so it's going to be really valuable to be able to capture that and see how it's impacted. And also, as I mentioned earlier, we weren't able to speak to all groups who are digitally excluded in Limerick. So, for example, citizens in Limerick City, some younger people who are socially excluded, or people who have migrated. So we'll be looking to try and speak to a wider range of people to be able to capture their thoughts. We'll then be doing a consultation process where we'll gather various stakeholders in Limerick as well as citizens in order to make sense of the results that we've collected so far and further generate ideas for policies to support the digital inclusion strategy.
Sorry, there you go.
Lovely, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Rachel. I think that was a very interesting and insightful presentation, and there's a lot in it. And I think we'll be looking forward to the second part of our research, and I suppose having a report that we can share with citizens, with policymakers, with service providers in the coming months. So we'll be looking forward to that. We'll move on now to our second speaker. So I'd like to introduce Dr. Iliana Hamburg from the Institute for Work and Technology in Gelsenkirchen, Germany. Iliana is head of their study group on lifelong learning. The group supports the achievement of the UN Sustainable Development Goal for Education, and a central focus of their work is supporting inclusion through digital solutions to lifelong learning, including innovations to improve the quality of life for people with special needs, migrants, and the elderly. So I'll hand over the mic now to Iliana if she unmutes herself, and she will.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me?
We can indeed.
Yes.
Loud and clear.
So, okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. I think the result of your study are very useful for Germany, particularly for our institute and for our region. Our institute is in Gelsenkirchen, in rural area. In Gelsenkirchen, there are many refugees and also European migrants. 40% of the people are unemployed. So you can see that digital exclusion is a very difficult problem and very actual. So our device is digital inclusion should be at the heart of response to COVID-19. I don't want to repeat what you said. I think a similar situation is also in Germany. I'd like to present the problem of the social distancing measures. You know, they are in Germany also a lot, and people demonstrate against these measures. They are necessary, but they have further exposed social inequalities and in its impact on a large section of the population, because they don't have the means to protect themselves against the virus. You know, social distancing measures requires means and resources. That a large section of the population, also in Germany, particularly in my city in Gelsenkirchen, they don't have. A lot of people, especially those from the marginalized section, do not have access to digital devices. They do not have required skills to use digital technologies. The SLIMS is the large number of children from disadvantaged backgrounds are losing out on education and motivation because they don't have access to the internet or the digital skills to take part in online classes, and nobody from the family can explain or can help them. Sure, there are problems also with the teachers because many of them have now digital skills and particularly digital skills for social inclusion. Sure, there are also problems with older people, but not very much. They find difficult to get, for example, basic things such sourcing grocery or medicine, but it is not a problem. A problem was with this social distancing with people with mental health condition, because they are struggling more than others to cope with the isolation. So there are problems, you know. I would like to say you them tell two events in Germany. The Digital Day 22. It was on 18th of June this year. Sure, many high-profile guests, government officials, and so business leader participated. This day was connected to many campaigns related to digitalization across Germany. The topic was Digital for All, and the focus was on digital participation. Sure, it was also about the use of open data facilitated by digital infrastructures, but not all layers in society experience the same quality or access to digital infrastructures. Sure, this Digital Day has highlighted the importance of digital inclusion and digital participation, which is relevant also for open data. Another event was a presentation in Germany of UNESCO's 2020 Global Education Monitoring Report, Inclusion and Education. It took place on 22 of September this year. Sure, many ministers and so vital participation. I would like to present only some points. I think they are important. Sure, you know, poverty is the main obstacle to success in education. Sure, everybody should receive the best possible support to achieve their full potential, and it should be a commitment of the global community. Another proposal was about global partnerships for education. Sure, in this time of COVID, existing inequalities are reinforced around the world. Global partnerships for education are very important. You know that minorities and refugees are still not adequately guaranteed access to high quality education in many countries around the world. In several Central and Eastern European countries, for example, Romania, Bulgaria, children from the Roma minority are taught separately from the majority society. Sure, some steps have been proposed towards inclusion, and with this goal in mind, the Federal Ministry of Education and Research is working to ensure strong, inclusive education in Germany. 2 weeks ago, the Ministry of Education, Federal Ministry, and together with the Education Ministry of German country, decided to give laptops and notebooks to teachers, and €10 per month for every for every student, in order to have an internet connection. A problem which is in Germany, I said something about it. Inclusion needs well-trained teaching staff. Sure, many education systems are based on the assumption that everyone has the same learning needs, but Just as people differ generally, they also differ in their approaching to learning. You know, teachers have a crucial role to play when it comes to ensuring participation in the education sector. They are key to more inclusion in everyday school life, but they need the necessary tools and skills. And last time I present a project, German project funded by the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, Inclusion 4.0, RUR, digital support system for employees with cognitive disabilities. And me and the Institute work to develop a suitable training approach in order to enable employees with a digital disability to secure and expand their jobs in workshops and companies by using innovative digital assistance systems. We work, for example, with a workshop for adapted work, Werkstatt für angepasste Arbeit, where about 60 disabled people come every year. Some of them work, and we try to develop training for the people who can work with such support systems. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Elena. That was very interesting. And I will just stop share now before we move on to the next. So move my camera, our next part of our event. I think that was a very interesting presentation, and I think it highlights how much we can learn from each other across different countries and different jurisdictions. I think a lot of what you highlighted there, I think many people in the event today may relate to and may recognize the challenges are similar. So as we go forward to the Digital Inclusion Working Group, I think it's great to be able to, I suppose, tap into the experience in other countries and other cities and see what we can learn. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next part of our event, and it is a panel discussion which will be chaired by Brendan Ryan of the Limerick and Clare Education and Training Board. Brendan is the Learning Technology Development Officer with the ETB, has been there for many years now, and has, I suppose, a particular interest in promoting digital inclusion in education and all parts of life. He's the chair of the Digital Inclusion Working Group, so he will chair the next session. We have a number of speakers. So we have Mary Flannery, also from the Limerick and Clare Education and Training Board. She's been the community education facilitator there since 2003. And prior to that, she worked in community development for 10 years in Ireland and Africa, and was a secondary school teacher as well, and has a particular interest in the social value of education and the relationship between state and civil society. Join us today also, we have Rob O'Driscoll, who is Head of Digital Services at Limerick City and County Council and has been there since 2008, having spent the earlier part of his career in the areas of software development, application support and business process improvement. He's been Digital Services Programme Manager in the Council since 2018 and was recently appointed the Head of Digital Services with responsibility for Smart Limerick, which we mentioned earlier. We also have Adrian O'Connell, who is Education and Training Coordinator with the West Limerick Resources. He's been there since 2004, originally a home economics teacher with 10 years of teaching second level education, as well as being involved in organising alternative and adult education. She currently works on the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme in West Limerick Resources, specialising in lifelong learning for all ages. And then we also have David Drabble, who is the senior researcher with the Tavistock Institute, who has worked with Rachel on the research project that we have been hearing about this afternoon. And with Rachel has also worked on the Medici project, which is a project that is, as I mentioned earlier, mapping digital inclusion across the EU. And his work is contributing towards the understanding of socio-technical systems in the digital world. So there are speakers. So with that, I will hand over to Brendan, who will take us through the next session. And again, I'll remind people, if you have comments or questions, use the chat facility, and we'll look at that in the last section of our event today. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. Again, yeah, just to reiterate what Helen just said, please do use the chat area for any questions you have, or any thoughts or comments even as the panel members answer a few questions we have pre-prepared for them. So I suppose the first question is for Mary, Mary Flannery. Mary, the earlier inputs highlighted how much the world is increasingly being digitalized. And I'm just wondering, in the world of learning and education, can you talk to us a little bit about how engaging in lifelong learning has changed, particularly with COVID this year, and if any steps that have been taken or can be taken to ensure learners that no learners are left behind and that there is inclusion in terms of the new digital realities?
Unmute.
Microphone mute, Mary, please.
Thanks, Brendan. Yeah, as Brendan said, I've been a member of the working group around this research project, and I'm really giving it away that I was also involved with the ICT project in 2008 when they were identifying the needs of disadvantaged groups in Limerick. So, but it's great to see this kind of the research kind of having moved on and focused on different elements. I suppose just to say, I, as I work with Limerick and Clare ETB, and I'm coming in this from the perspective of community education with the ETB. And we work in partnership with about 30 local community groups and schools in the provision of community education. And like that local reach and connectivity is crucial really to the development of learning projects and digital inclusion and addressing local needs and empowering learners and communities. So just kind of to preface it with that. And also to say, I suppose, that lifelong learning and lifelong learning has become more digitized kind of, you know, before COVID, kind of over the last number of years. And probably what has happened during COVID is that it has been fast-tracked a bit, kind of the necessity being the mother of invention. When Rachel was talking, she mentioned about I suppose systems or ways of registering with services that have become digitized. And I just want to, I suppose, mention one example for us in the lifelong learning, and people will be familiar with the online registration process. We know it locally as the Fetch registration, and I suppose this was a national initiative that was when there was kind of structural changes within further education and training in Ireland. There was seemed to be a gap in the data about participation in further education and training or lifelong learning. So there was a real focus on gathering that information, and a registration process was put in place, an online one, initially a paper one, that was a very, very long paper document. And then now, and we're using it completely, is an online registration, the Fetch online registration process. I suppose in terms of learners engaging in community education, this system initially presented huge challenges for many learners, particularly those with low levels of digital skill and older learners. And I suppose my sense of it, it was a national initiative. It was a one-size-fits-all approach, and you know, it was quite difficult to navigate. So I suppose our response to that, and across the further education and training provision, in particularly in the areas of unaccredited and lower levels of accredited learning, a lot of work was done to support learners to complete online registration, like, you know, easy to follow guides, one-to-one practical support and encouragement. Some of the things that Rachel mentioned kind of as supporting kind of digital inclusion. And I suppose the other thing that was done was that we were feeding back up, you know, to our operations manager, who was feeding back up to Solace about how the system could be made more user-friendly. And for the most part, these kind of suggestions have been taken on board. I think the other thing about the level of support that has been possible, kind of the one-to-one, has been impacted by GDPR. That has been a factor in, you know, trying to support learners. I suppose the research highlighted the value of patience and respect in the introduction of new initiatives like the online registration process. And I suppose it is the skill and the patience of tutors and community workers in supporting online registration, as well as the resolving of the glitches along the way, that have kind of led to the situation now where there's a lot more buy-in from learners about online registration, and that kind of resistance that was there hugely at the start has been kind of, you know, addressed to some extent, and people want to engage in learning, so they're happy enough to go along with it. I suppose the other thing specifically around COVID, that an example of the impact of COVID has been the adoption of an online learning platform called Padlet for community education. And we'll kind of credit Brendan again with the suggestion for the use of this. But I suppose COVID-19 has accelerated the development of online learning options for us. And just to say that I suppose that for community education, like face-to-face interaction is like the hallmark of community education, and the importance of the tea break can't be underestimated in that as well. But when the COVID restrictions came in, it meant that this type of learning was no longer possible. And then the challenge was to find a way to continue to engage with learners, especially at a time where people were feeling vulnerable and isolated. So, I mean, learners themselves, they set up WhatsApp support and learning support groups, but we needed a secure online platform, and Brendan suggested Padlet as an online and a user-friendly platform as well. Now, just to say briefly, if people aren't familiar with Padlet, it's an online notice board which allows kind of the creation of, you know, notes and texts and images and audio and visuals, videos and web links and so on. And these can be shared with tutors, with learners, and as a way of connecting, but also that learners can engage back in to what's being taught. We introduced Padlet in May, and initially it was primarily as a way of kind of keeping in contact with learners. However, and just at that time, we also sent out a postcard to 600 learners to say, you know, log on to Padlet just to see what's there, that the learning can still go on. And I suppose that it was, as I say, introduced initially as a way of keeping contact with learners, but now it's increasingly being used as a teaching and learning tool. And just as an example, like face-to-face classes have resumed, but now the size of some of these classes has had to be reduced in line with the COVID-19 restrictions and the social distancing and so on. So the venues, community venues, may not be able to hold a full class. So people are happy to split in two and to have a smaller group coming in every other week. So they're able to stay engaged during the week, during the face-to-face, and the week that they're not in, they can log on to Padlet, you know, to kind of still kind of keep contact with the learning. So that's kind of an example of kind of what's been used. And just finally to say, I suppose that, again, keeping with the research, like that time is such an important element, because the Padlet, you know, is being used in community education across the ETB. But like all new technology, kind of will take time to embed and to settle, and to kind of out of respect for the learners to give that time as well. So that's really, I suppose, my sense of the, you know, from the research.
Thank you very much, Mary. I think you give a very comprehensive overview, both from a teaching and learning perspective, but also in terms of the administration and sign-up processes in education training at the moment, and their, I suppose, the relationship to the research that we heard about earlier. I suppose just to move on, maybe Adrian, as again was outlined earlier, there are a lot of challenges around digital inclusion at the moment, and I'm just wondering, have steps been taken to overcome these in community settings that you're aware of, and are there any good practices that we might be able to draw on, in particular maybe over the last number of months, that you're aware of from the community setting? So second question is for Adrian.
Thank you, Brendan, and hello to everybody. I'm happy to be part of this today. Yeah, I suppose just to put what I want to talk about in context, I'm going to go back over a couple of things that maybe Rachel had touched on, and in fact Mary touched on as well. And from my reading of the research, You know, this research, along with our experience now of COVID-19, it has made us all a lot more aware of digital exclusion. I'm not talking about just participants or learners, but us as workers on the ground as well. From the research, you know, and indeed other research that Tavistock have pointed to in the research, there are 4 main factors influencing digital exclusion, and they can be summed up as age, education status, income, and geography. Now, you know, these factors can actually be similar factors that affect social inequality. And as mentioned in the report, social inequality plays a big part in digital exclusion. And this link between digital exclusion and social inequality really struck a chord with me when I was looking at the research and preparing for today. You know, in our work at West Limerick Resources, which for everybody participating is one of 3 local development companies in the Limerick City and County area, along with our colleagues in Ballyharrow Development and in Paul Partnership. And under the SICAP, or the Social Inclusion and Community Activation Programme, we have always worked with socially excluded communities and individuals. But now they face an extra, this new added barrier of digital exclusion. And that has come to the fore, particularly during COVID-19 for us. I suppose I was conscious in speaking today that this does not necessarily imply that we must look at it from a negative point of view, but rather as another challenge, and to see how best we can support people to try and overcome it. I suppose, as a little aside, I think it's a bit akin to rural electrification in Ireland in the 1940s. You know, that transformed hundreds and thousands of lives in Ireland. And would you believe it, even though it's over 70 years ago, at that time it was promoted that it would help reduce social isolation in Ireland. And here we are more than 70 years later, talking about something very similar. You know, those words social isolation keep coming up. Of course, it is pure coincidence that the research came about at the same time as COVID-19 hit. And it plunged us into a new way of working right across all of our agencies. So at West Limerick Resources, we had to, and therefore wanted to, look at new ways to engage and remain in contact with the people that we support. So, you know, while humble telephone was still to the fore and allowed us to give advice and point people in the right directions and stay in immediate contact with people, we did slowly but surely move into the areas of WhatsApp video calls, FaceTime calls, you know, Zoom meetings, team meetings, and it took us as workers, and therefore, you know, participants that we engage with, quite a while to get used to those kind of new ways of communicating with each other. And I suppose, as much and all as an important role that those areas of communication have played and continue to play for us in our work, it's only successful if the person at the other end has the knowledge and hardware to be able to communicate in these ways with us. So that's been touched on already by Rachel in the research findings as well. We experienced a great number of people who could not communicate in this new way. And this is where the digital exclusion concept really started to be a stark reality for us in our work and trying to support people in our communities. Now, Brendan, you touched on it there, and a big part of this question is some examples of steps that might have been taken to try and counteract those difficulties that we found. So just as an example, some of the steps were quite practical. Before the Leaving Certificate was cancelled, we had engaged with a local secondary school and given a loan of laptops that we had as a training suite to disadvantaged students within the school that were identified through the school. And they were so appreciative of them, and they were able to work away where in homes they either didn't have a laptop at all, or maybe there was only one laptop and it was this idea of having to share with others in the family. So for Leaving Cert students, they got an opportunity to have one of their own on a loan basis. I suppose at the start of lockdown, our community development department developed a digital map of West Limerick, where community connections could be made and pointed out on a map, and it was shared through social media and on hard copies. We printed them off and handed them out to people, but connections could be made across the West Limerick area. That came about, if any of you recall, through the community response teams that were put together during lockdown, and to try and support continued communication with people. I suppose from our own learning, it has to be pointed out that even though we had a Facebook page all along, we got better at using it. We started to use it a lot more often, and it was instant connection for people, and keeping people informed of things that were happening. And sure enough, the hits that we've had on our Facebook page have been huge in number since we started using it a lot more. And I suppose just new things that came up for us, we developed a YouTube channel. Never in our lives did we think that we'd be going down that road. And it allowed us to develop videos along the themes of family support, IT tuition and support for people, and also physical and mental health support through videos that people were able to view on the YouTube channel. You know, a lot of people might not have been used to communicating through Zoom or team meetings or things like that, but a lot of people would be used to viewing YouTube, and it was stark for us to know that we had to go and meet people where what their starting point was. And I suppose in a wider context, it might be touched on later on, but you know, through our connections and our work, we obviously work very closely with Limerick City and County Council, and through the National Broadband Strategy, they've actually been working with us to identify black spots of connectivity in West Limerick, and it's still ongoing, but there's a rollout of what are called advanced hotspot facilities in rural settings. For us, it's in areas of Strand and Lahal in West Limerick, where there's going to be these advanced hotspot facilities put in place where people can connect through the internet, where they might not have been able to do so before. Now COVID has interfered with that a little bit, in that where they might have gone and sat in their local community facility to do that, that's being looked at the moment with the community facilities because of social distancing and things like that. So yes, there's been quite a buzz around the development of what alternatives can be used. I suppose I'd have to finish off by saying it's not really a replacement for that direct contact with people and that personal contact with people. But I think it was Mary maybe touched on the idea of blended learning earlier. We're kind of looking at a blended way of supporting people when we can, to try and meet with people conscious of COVID-19 and social distancing, and in the meantime continuing with a remote facility of keeping in communication with people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adrian. I think what that highlights, for me anyway, is the pragmatic nature of digital inclusion and how much it is a real life issue, and how the steps to address it can be from the simple to the complex, you know, but are locally based and need to be locally based. My final targeted question, we'll call it that, is to Rob. And I just want to say before, I suppose this digital inclusion group is a subgroup of Smart Limerick, which is a council-led initiative. So I think it's a great credit due to Limerick in relation to this initiative, because I think it's the only smart initiative that has a digital inclusion element or subgroup. So I'm delighted to chair the group on behalf of Limerick and Clare Education and Training Board. But I suppose it's really good to see that I suppose in Limerick we're one of the few groups, I think the only group, that has a digital inclusion working group. So my question for Rob is, as we move forward in developing Limerick as a smart city or region, I think, how can service providers and policy makers ensure that services remain accessible to all?
Thanks, Brendan. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, I suppose just to give a small bit of background, like you said, our digital strategy was established in 2017, aimed to lay the foundation for a smart Limerick region that uses digital technologies to empower our communities and try to improve the overall quality of life for our people. And the vision for Smart Limerick is multifaceted, but I think there's two parts of that vision that are particularly relevant to today's discussion. The first is that Limerick is a place of digital equality where access to information creates opportunities for all its citizens. And the second is that the potential of our public services, driven by our desire to put people first, is unlocked by the use of digital technologies. So coming to the question I've been asked to speak to today, how can service providers make sure services remain accessible for all? I think when we look at services, there's really two areas that we need to focus on at a high level. The first being access to the services themselves, and then once access is established, what the user's experience of using the service is like. On the subject of access, I mean, I think it was highlighted in the research that the amount of citizens that don't have access to a reliable internet connection is a real problem for us. I'm working with the National Broadband Ireland at the moment, and their information says that there's 21,000 premises, and by premises we mean homes, farms, schools and businesses, etc., in Limerick that don't have access to a high-speed broadband connection, which is roughly 22% of all premises in the county. So it's quite prevalent. And I think, as mentioned by a few speakers already, the COVID-19 pandemic has really emphasized the digital divide and how our high-speed, reliable broadband connection has become a vital utility for everyone. So to this end, I mean, the Limerick City County Council fully supports the rollout of the National Broadband Plan, but the reality is that it's a 5 to 7 year plan. So as Adrian mentioned, we're working on the concept of what's called broadband connection points, which are key rural areas that will receive an early connection under the National Broadband Plan. It'll be, rather than a fiber broadband connection, it'll be a radio broadband connection with a minimum of 500 megabits per second download speeds. These BCPs are in areas that are called intervention areas. They're areas that don't actually have a commercial broadband service available already. We've currently got 2 community centres that have been confirmed as BCPs. One of them is Caroline and the other is Glenmore in Strand. We've got applications in for a further 12, and I'm currently trying to get another 3 in there as well. And in addition, we'll have 6 national schools that will be connected to a similar radio broadband service. But these BCPs have potential beyond just offering free public Wi-Fi. You know, they have potential to become digital hubs in communities, offer temporary working hot desk locations for people to work, community spaces to enable digital learning, that kind of thing. There's one BCP I've heard of in another county that is actually a community centre, but it also hosts a creche in one part of the building, while in another building they have a digital space where the parents of the children who are attending the creche can work or study during school hours in the same location. And in addition to the broadband side of things, we've also got funding from the EU to roll out, under the Wi-Fi for You initiative, 40 free public Wi-Fi access points across Limerick City and County to add to the 17 we already have in place. So between the two of those initiatives, I think we're making some good progress on the infrastructure side of things to try and address the issue of access to digital services. When we look at services themselves, though, first and foremost, we're happy that the research supports our own approach for online services, in that they should be an additional channel of service provision rather than a replacement for any of the existing channels. I really strongly believe we should be promoting the benefits of online services in as much as we can, you know, potential to be faster, more efficient, environmentally friendly, and more convenient in that people can engage with us 24/7, 365 days a year if they'd like to, as opposed to just within business hours. So we're really putting the onus back on the digital citizen, as we like to call them, to engage with us on their own terms. But there will always be members of society who will prefer face-to-face interactions or over the phone engagements. So I think all service providers in all sectors need to be mindful of that. I think we touched on accessibility earlier on. That's something that's also key for us. And in our own experience, we tend to take that into account right from the planning and the service design phase. And I point to our limerick.ie website as a really good example of this. You know, this is an online space that's arisen from our information and marketing program of the digital strategy. We attract something like 1.1 million unique visitors to the site every year. We've received awards. It's one of the top tourism websites, voted one of the top tourism websites globally in 2018. but we've designed it with accessibility in mind. So we have things like alternative text for images and buttons for visually impaired users. We have a mobile responsive display that will work on any type of, in any type of browser, any of the modern browsers, including text-only browsers and screen readers, but works particularly well on mobile devices like tablets and smartphones, which the research suggests is the most commonly owned device type. And I think for organizations such as ourselves that offer multiple services online, it's a really key thing to make sure that the service itself is simple to use and simple to understand, and is also that the user experience is kept consistent between services. So if you offer a lot of services, if someone can apply for one, they should be able to apply for any of your services. And you know, to achieve this, for our services, what we tend to do is we run business process improvement exercises to evaluate what's good and bad about our existing service offering, see what the areas of improvement are, and always do this from the point of view of the end user to make sure that we're putting ourselves in their shoes to try and see what the challenges might be from their point of view and try to design the service to suit that. And also, rather than looking at particular services in isolation, our approach has been to study groups of services together. So rather than looking at trying to improve a particular license service, like a residential parking permit, for example, we look at all licenses from top down, look at the processes there, try to see what the commonalities are, and come up with a generic process for handling licenses that our organization will issue. And from that, we can develop a standard online service experience that will be consistent across all the different services that we deliver. And this can be extrapolated to the national context as well. You're probably aware that there's a work underway at the moment to develop a national service catalogue, which will capture all the different types of services that local authorities provide around the country. This is heavily influenced by Limerick, as you probably know, through Mihai's hard work. But what it will do is bring consistency to how services are both applied for and also delivered across local authorities. So regardless of what county you live in, what local authority you deal with, your experience should be consistent. And I think if we can get to this stage where we have that kind of consistency across services, there may be an opportunity to develop digital training subsequent to that for citizens on how to apply for council services that would be relevant to all citizens, regardless of what county or local authority they're dealing with. And just a couple of other things I'd like to mention as well in relation to services. It was highlighted in the research that a single authenticated account is not necessarily a good thing, and there are certainly cases where being forced to sign up for a digital ID that you don't need is counterintuitive, but we have used it with some success on our limerick.ie platform with our portal that we call My Limerick. And to get people to register for that, they can use simple registration process with email and password, but we also give them the ability to sign up with existing Google and Facebook accounts that they have. So rather than have to go and register for something specifically for that purpose, we can try to reuse accounts that they already have to try and make that easier for them. And within that portal, then we can centralize the experiences they have with the availing of council services, whether it be information requests or service requests can be tracked as cases. If they apply for licenses, we can track, or the citizen can track their own requests for licenses within the portal. They can view historical license that they've been issued in the past, that kind of thing. And we're hoping to expand that out to cover grants as well in the next 12 months. And the final point I'd like to make is just in relation to automation of services. I think this was highlighted as well in the research as being an area of concern. But I strongly believe that when it's done well, it can be, especially in the context of like a call center or something like that, it can be used quite effectively to deal with a lot of issues really quickly before they have to get a staff member involved to deal with something like that. And in this case, it has the potential to really free up staff members, perhaps to deal with other people who want to engage through the more traditional channels, but also to focus on other things like service improvement. So that's really what I wanted to say. And just final point, I suppose, we really welcome the research from Tavistock. I think it's been really well done, and we hope once it's finalised, we can share with all parties to try and inform service delivery in all areas of our region, just to try and advance the aims of our digital strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Rob, and thanks for that, for enlightening us on council activity and very comprehensive. I suppose finally, before I hand back, we're a little behind time, and just before I hand back to Helen, I have one question maybe for David, and that is, And I just posted in the chat, and please do use the chat facility for the final. We have a little bit of time at the end, but I suppose COVID-19 has put a magnifying glass on all things digital this year. It's slightly coincidental that we were doing the research that Helen had and Paul had worked on commissioning the research with us, with the group this year. To what extent do you think that this has put digital inclusion under the spotlight? And do you think that'll be sustained beyond COVID?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Brendan. It's a really interesting one, because I think that it certainly has been more under the spotlight with people who are really isolated at the moment, who are, really experiencing quite a lot of difficulties. So I think on that side, there's definitely some push. And I just imagine that it's really forced a lot of people and a lot of government agencies to address the issue in a way that they wouldn't have before. So I think for individuals, I mean, at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a lot of talk about, how are some people going to transport, get food if they don't have a car, for example, or how can people who have, don't have a laptop but have children who need to access resources from the schools and that sort of thing. And I think over the last few months, a lot of people individually must have just found workarounds and ways to work through that, because when you're confronted with such a difficult issue, you do tend to address that. So I imagine there's going to be fewer people that are sort of lacking devices. I mean, it might just be a marginal thing, but there will be some shift in that. And I think at government level as well, I was talking to someone doing some work in Paris recently, and she said that the government in France has really, given her organisation a lot of money to work with digital inclusion and to sort of start new programmes and do innovative new things. So I think that individually in government are really going to be, trying to address digital inclusion right now in a way that they wouldn't have been doing before. But I think that there are still some people out there who are just never going to be addressed in that way, unless you get them face to face and kind of work with them to get online, because the reason why they aren't using it because they don't want to use it. There's quite a lot of people that we had talked to in the research that just felt a bit resentful towards the push to get online. And I think some of the best ways are build trust, like Rachel was saying earlier, to sort of build trust and do face-to-face contact, and over time sort of get over those barriers and show that it's not as difficult as it seems. And that's one thing, but I think some people are always going to be quite intransigent towards that. And I think, that's a sort of natural reaction as well that we do need to work with. I mean, there's a lot of people who I know who've gone through like digital detoxes. And it's because it's quite stressful to be remote. It's quite stressful to not see people face to face, especially if you're really used to that, and that means a lot to you. So I think that the alternatives obviously should always be available, and Rob was saying that as well earlier. But it's really tricky to do that during COVID because the face-to-face contact is just not really available right now. So it's a bit of a double bind, really. But yeah, I can see definitely that the impact is going to be really quite long-standing.
Okay. Thank you, David. I'm going to hand back to Helen now. Just before I do, just to acknowledge, I suppose, the reason for this research in the beginning was so that the group would have an evidence-based model for moving forward. And when we decided to conduct the research, without the Paul partnership, Helen and Rosie, they bought that research expertise, and that's why they're leading this seminar, and that's why, so I would just like to acknowledge their work in bringing this to fruition. It still has to be brought fully to fruition with the completion of the research. So just a huge thanks to Helen and Rosie on behalf of the Digital Inclusion Working Group for leading out on this. It's a very important piece of work, particularly this year, and they've done phenomenal work in terms of taking the lead from the Limerick side of it on behalf of the group. So I'll hand back to you, Helen, with that, and thanks to everyone for your inputs.
Thank you, Brendan. But I have to say it's very much a partnership approach, as our organisation's name says. It's very much we wouldn't have been able to do this on our own. It's part of the interagency group that is the Digital Inclusion Working Group. So we were delighted to be part of it. But we've a lot of work still to do, and I know we got a lot of information today, and I hope that people listening that a lot of what they've heard resonates with them. But we still feel that we have more perspectives and more experiences that we need to document. So we will be looking forward to doing part 2 of our primary research. And to that end, for anyone who is watching today, if they would be interested in taking part in our second stage of the primary research, or if they work with communities who know that have very much first-hand experience of digital exclusion, particularly in the last couple of months, that have a lot to say and would like their voice to be heard, to contact either myself or Rosie. I think most people in the group probably have my email address, and they should have Rosie's email address from receiving the link for today. So we'd be keen to, I suppose, capture the wider range of voices that people and opinions that people have in this topic. I suppose before we finish, I'm sure there are people who want to say something, contribute something, and I know the messaging part of the Zoom people have been using it. So I might hand over to Rosie for a few moments, who might give a summary of what people have been saying, or any questions.
Sure, thanks Helen, and thanks to all the presenters and panelists. It was very interesting. Just before I go into that, I do have, as part of the Limerick Lifelong Learning Festival's overall evaluation, they've asked us to distribute an online survey. So I'm just going to put the link into the chat. Especially this year, it's very important because it is all online. So to get all your input about how those events were doing, that would be great. I've just pasted the wrong thing in there, so if you just bear with me one moment.
And I think we will also be sending the link out afterwards, so people can click on it after the event if they don't have the time to do it now. But
yeah,
yes.
And as I say, it's just a 5-minute survey, and as Helen says, we'll send that out afterwards as well. It's in the chat there if anybody wants to click on it now. In terms of then what's been coming up in the chat, we've seen that somebody said that it's great to see the progression from Limerick ICT Steering Group back in 2008 to the broader comprehensive and qualitative research that Tavistock have talked to us about today. And it continues as a key issue for learners and for all of us in understanding the current barriers and supporting community learners. Remote learning and social distancing are also added challenges for all of us during this time as well. And it also mentions the Padlet, which I think Mary Flannery mentioned. It was a great innovation. Another question, I think this is, would you mind if I asked, have you encountered problems where learners just don't have the hardware required, such as smartphones, laptops, and how might this be addressed, if at all? And that question would be from Mary Flannery. If you'd like to give us a quick answer to that, if you have one, Mary.
Unfortunately, I don't have quick answers, but I replied back. I mean, and I suppose it is an issue, you know, that people don't have the devices. Now, one of the things, and Brendan might be able to come in here as well, because for learners in further education and training, there's a real awareness of people working off no devices or kind of ones that are not suitable. So a program of kind of loaning devices has started. Now, needless to say, you know, when you're talking about thousands of learners, you know, it's like no program is going to be able to address that need completely. But I suppose it's a start, and it was it's kind of ongoing at the moment. So that's, I suppose, some attempt to kind of to address that need. I don't know if Brendan might be able to add to that, because he may be more familiar with it.
I'll be very brief, Mary. We're not going to meet all the need, but like as this conference call was happening, I got a knock on the door. 412 laptops had arrived for distribution, but that's not going to meet. I mean, I'd just be careful for anyone that's on the line. It's not going to meet the need of all learners. We have to target at those most in need. So there are literally hundreds of devices, but we have thousands of learners, and trying to match the greatest need to to the available resources is going to be a huge challenge. We have processes that we're putting in place rapidly at the moment, so hopefully it will in some way address potential barriers to digital inclusion, that particular initiative. It's only one piece of a jigsaw, but an important piece. Hardware is important.
Super. And then I think the only other comment or question, David Drabble, I think, has already answered that, and it's how we reflect on how COVID-19 has put a magnifying glass on everything digital this year. But I think David has kind of covered that. But if anybody else wants to add to that before the end of the webinar.
I would encourage people, if anyone would like to make a contribution or just an observation, if they want to unmute themselves and speak up. We have a few minutes left.
Hi, how you doing? Jerry Griffin here. I can agree with David there. I think generally people, especially people over 50 or thereabouts, what COVID has brought to them is the kind of loneliness they experience, online stuff. So I think they do like the face-to-face, watching people in the bank now, they generally keep away from the automation. Just like someone to hear, hear that conversation. So even though COVID is keeping people away from that face-to-face, but people seem to want the face-to-face as well,
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does indeed. Does anyone else want to add to that? Okay, we're coming up to 3 minutes to 4, so we might wrap up. I suppose some of the key words that I was jotting down as people were speaking that I think it might be important to kind of leave with, what I was hearing, what I'm taking away from it is, as much as we've kind of experienced all these new challenges this year, there is innovation happening at a personal level, individual level, at an organizational level, and hopefully at a statutory policy making level as well. I'm hearing resilience as well from people, and one of the things that came out strong for me as well is that importance of having blended or alternative ways to engage with services. So yes, being able to access services and engage through digital platforms is fantastic, and it can be great, but it's not the only way, and that face-to-face engagement is very important for many people too. So being able to have both is, I suppose, the ideal scenario. And I think it's great. I think there was a lot of commonality in the contributions today, and I'm delighted that we have a number of different sectors that are working together through the Digital Inclusion Working Group, from the community sector, local authority, statutory sectors, that we're all looking at this together. And as we progress with our research and move into actually then action and developing responses to address the issues that are coming up in the research, that we will have, I suppose, effective responses to the issues that we've addressed here today. So I'd be, I suppose, positive that we will, that the future will hopefully will be bright, and that we there's a commitment, and I think David said it in his when he was talking as well, about there is a new commitment to addressing the issues of digital exclusion and an awareness of how important digital inclusion is as well. So with that, I will just finish off by saying a number of thank yous. In particular, I'd like to thank everyone who presented and spoke on the panel here today. When I rang them and with this idea that we would have this event today as part of Limerick Lifelong Learning Festival, nobody said no to me, which is great. I'd like to also thank all the attendees. I hope you found the conversation and the presentations and discussion interesting. It's a busy time, and we're taking an hour and a half out of your time, so thank you so much for attending, and I hope you found it useful. And again, just to reiterate, if people do want to get involved in the next stage of the research, either to taking part in focus groups or supporting communities or groups or individuals that you might work with or support to take part in a focus group, or to take part in the consultation syndicate, which is the last stage of our research, where we bring all the various different stakeholders together to try and tease out what we've learned and where we should be going, to contact either myself and Rossi. We'd love to be have you involved. So that's it. It's 4 o'clock on the dot. I will let everyone go, and I say thank you very much for your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Thanks, Helen.
Thank you. Thank you.